Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Turner and I am the Vice President of the CECIP Legal Metrology Group. I have been undertaking legal metrology for nearly 40 years and my background is as a market surveillance officer, as an inspector. But I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with CECIP, the European Trade Association, for about 18 years now. And I'd like to thank you for this opportunity of allowing CECIP to give some thoughts on how we can think about whether private sector bodies can be involved in legal metrology enforcement. It's a great privilege and please feel free to send any questions. I think our starting point for this is that many countries are having to ask fundamental questions regarding funding. The historical method of legal metrology, and this stretches back through to the French Revolution and Napoleon, is for that body to be a government institution, and the people in the field, the market surveillance, the scientific laboratories, all to be government employees. This legal metrology infrastructure has worked well for many years. And it's good. I think it's important. It has got the advantages of being independent, of transparent. But in 2024 and in the middle of the 21st century, it's expensive. So lots of different nations are beginning to think about how we could reappraise this. And what we're thinking about in this presentation is the mixture. Is it permissible? What are the advantages and disadvantages of using private sector employment? Can there be a mixture? Could we have it totally private sector? It's a whole set of questions that I'm not for one moment attempting to give you an answer, but I think they are questions worthy of consideration. So thank you very much. I think what we see in Europe is some countries have begun to allow private sector economic operators. There's a whole range. I think some countries it's not allowed at all. In other countries it's highly privatised. There are different functions undertaken by different laboratories and different organisations. So I think what we'll look at here is some of the theory, some of the documents behind these different models and how they work. And I think also then we can look at some of the different examples, a brief look at some of the examples that we see across Europe. Our starting point, as ever, is the OML. They will produce a whole series of documents, and the one that we're looking at here is something called OML D1. I think its title is National Metrology Systems Developing the Institutional and Legislative Frameworks. Very good document. It's very useful in discussions like this because many people have thought about these things previously. I think the takeaways from the OML D1 is that it breaks the legal metrology landscape down into what it calls Tier 1 and Tier 2, and then further subdivisions in what it calls Tier 2. So Tier 1, it calls policy and legislation. We'll have a look in more detail at what Tier 1 might mean, but policy and legislation, it suggests will always stay as a governmental function. It's important to recognise that legal metrology is part of a national infrastructure of a country, and at the top level it should remain in that area. Tier 2 it calls enforcement, and it further breaks that down into pre-market type approval, and it calls type approval, pre-market verification or testing by authorised persons, and post-market. So the European model works heavily on this idea of pre-market and post-market. They call it placing on the market in Europe, and it's an important marker here. And OML D1 expressly recognises that private actors can be involved in legal metrology. So at the OML level, there isn't any excluding. It's interesting that it does not specifically even exclude market surveillance functions being privatised. The levels of privatisation and the way that privatisation works is discussed in part 5 of the OML document. And I think it's a well-written document. I think it helps us in these discussions for the future. I think what's important, and the most important point of this slide, is that it recognises different delivery models of policy decisions. And it's the point here is that the policy and the legislation will always sit with the government function. The delivery is the mixture where we can have, but the policy and who decides this will be a function of the national government. This slide here is a useful schematic that tries to outline this sort of two-tier system, the post-market and the pre-market. And I think it clearly illustrates the different models that can. And I think the important point here is that these different boxes, parts of the schematic, can be executed by different bodies. So that's a nice drawing to try and illustrate how this point is. But as we've said earlier, it's always important that the decisions, the actual decisions, are made at a government at a policy level. I think, to repeat the theme here, IMLD1 recognises that this should remain a function of the government. And I think for transparency, it's fundamental. So in the view of CECIP, it's fundamental that it remains as a function of government. The government should also be responsible for the legislation. I think it's important because the government will reflect the legislation a country needs, and it will reflect how that can best be achieved. It must ensure that the correct and applicable laws. There isn't any point in having laws that can't be applied, and there isn't any point in having insufficient laws to regulate a market. There's always a fine balance, and there is always that interesting interface between global trade and what countries regulate, while some countries regulate and others, but this must always be a function of the national government that carries this out. I think where the discussion begins to get interesting is in the pre-market. So already we see the OMLD1 talks about type approvals, talks about pre-market verification, testing by authorised persons, and testing to support self-declaration. And already in the European system, this is heavily carried out by private economic actors. Type approval process is carried out by private entities, notified bodies, and the certification of manufacturers to undertake what is called self-declaration is operated by private bodies. So this market-driven scheme is very strong in Europe and has been for many years. I've got to remember that the original NAWI directive, 2014-31, is 1990. So we're many years now as that has been working. And I think it's, again, other instruments. So CECIP look clearly at weighing instruments, both automatic and non-automatic. But other instruments, tachometers, medical instruments, this can be driven by the demands of the country. It's important that this is one of the major drivers of how it's done. It's often a question of resource. At the end of the day, if there's sufficient money to regulate given markets, that's a good thing. But if that money isn't present, that's the question that needs to be addressed. But I think we can safely say that in the European market, it's well organised and well put together. The transparency of the sector, one of the clear questions is, if we are going to open up, shall we say, to a private market, how this operates, it needs to have transparency and it needs to have credibility. And the market system in Europe operates with the 17,000 series of standards, covering certification and accreditation. And I think it's significant that all of the private sector bodies, the notified bodies that carry out this process, are accredited. So they will be covered by national accreditation bodies. And there's regulation. So we have the regulations 765 and the decision 768 will cover this. So it's a fairly well unified system. For those of you that might want to research this in any more detail, there's a document called the Blue Guide, and in Chapter 6 this is given in a lot of detail in Chapter 6. I think the other important takeaway here is that it covers not just legal metrology. This whole process of having private economic actors in the pre-market environment covers product safety of different products across the market. And I think from many years of being myself using it, working with it, dealing with it, working for notified bodies. It works well, I think. There are problems, and we can go on to think what those are. They can be very expensive. So notified bodies operate as private entities and can be very expensive indeed, especially for legal metrology. They're expensive entities to run, and they have to clearly ensure sufficient business to justify themselves. When we look at such things as railway bridges, huge sums of money necessary to operate notified bodies for these things, and it can be a block on a market. And I think we've led to inevitable inconsistencies. The European market attempts to coordinate those inconsistencies, and does, to a large extent, does do very well, but it's inevitable. There's an organisation called Nobomet which attempts to sort of quantify these things, but moderate success. In reality, this has led to many notified bodies being what I think we could describe as quasi-independent. They are independent, they have their own economic models, but they are always in some kind of relationship with government. And I think it works well. I have no professional view as to any major failings. I think it's a model that countries should be thinking about for the future. I think private entities have taken the form in the post-market environment in some European countries. The implementation here is a lot more variable. In some countries, not at all. Absolutely not. It's politically not acceptable. In other countries, it's quite accepted. I think from the point of view of CECIP, this is problematic with respect to ensuring a level playing field. So companies can place a lot of time and effort on placing instruments on the market, but when we get in the post-market, different countries have got different requirements. If we think about the Republic of Ireland, subsequent verification by manufacturers that have been approved works quite well. We allow France, it allows periodic re-verification of national requirement. Again, seems to work quite well. We go to countries like Germany, absolutely not. There's no acceptance of post-market inspection verifications there. I think Portugal is an example that seems to have taken it very broadly, and we have a wide range of instruments and a wide range of entities permitted as private bodies. I think significantly includes these packages under the Directive 76211, and I think that's almost unique in Europe. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I believe it's almost unique where the enforcement of packages is done by private entities in Portugal. So probably a good model to think about if you want to think about how this would work. This slide here is something put together by CECIP, and it should try to give you an idea of the different varieties, the different models, if you will. I think we spent a lot of work on it, and it seems to work quite well. I think what's important to note in this patchwork, if you will, is that for the purposes of pre-market, acceptance of the private sector is pretty well recognised. In terms of post-market, different decisions for different countries, but nobody yet has gone down the route of having post-market market surveillance. There's no reason why not. If it was tightly controlled, there isn't any reason that contracts could be issued by central government and a private entity could deliver those. There would need to be a formal and enforceable contract. And I think in some places you've seen people contemplating in this via sanctions are done via civil rather than criminal sanctions. I think it's many years before this will be thoroughly accepted, but there's no reason on paper at least. So briefly in conclusion, mixture of public and private entities being involved in delivery supervision is embedded in the legislation, well recognised, and there aren't any major problems. We always remember the ultimate control for the system sits with the government and is a question of policy and a wide range of different models. Different countries have got different models. I think the ones we've looked at here are Ireland, France and Portugal. and it's a whole spectrum of differences. We look at Hungary, we look at Poland, we look at Germany, and no acceptance at all. And I think it's important to remember that no European countries have allowed private market surveillance yet, but it's administratively possible. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity of giving some of CECIP's points of views, and I look forward to talking with you in the future.